Buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Mariano Torcal, soy el director de RECSM y tengo el honor de presentar a la investigadora y vice directora del RECSM también, pero investigadora Melanie Revilla. Para mí es un honor presentarla porque es el activo más importante que tenemos en RECSM. Es una de las investigadoras más destacadas, diría, de toda Europa y por tanto del mundo sobre temas relacionados con Service Methodology. Su currículum es impresionante y me llevaría aquí media hora tener que relatar y especificar todas las enormes publicaciones que tiene. Es una especialista tremenda en muchos temas relacionados con Web Service Data, pero bueno, últimamente, dado que tiene un VRC, he trabajado sobre temas que tienen que ver relacionados con la mejora y aplicación de Web Service Data con nuevas tecnologías y en concreto con los móviles. Y luego además hay otro tema que también creo que va a presentar y que a mí me interesa mucho, que es el tema de la utilización del Passive Meter o el Behavioral Tracker en encuestas online. Yo tengo el privilegio de poder contar con ella en un proyecto de investigación sobre polarización, que conjuntamente con uno que trabaja con ella, que subió el Bosch, han estado trabajando enormemente en el proyecto y bueno, me parece que están en the very top state of the art sobre ese tema y la verdad es que pues estoy muy contento de poder contar con ellos porque es un plus enorme para en respecto a ese proyecto. No tengo mucho más que decir, excepto que bueno, no podía dejar de estar hoy aquí para presentaros todos a la profesora Melanie Revilla. By the way, I'm sorry, I'm talking in Spanish. I don't know why. I just realized it's too early for me. So let me just say that again in English that this is an honor for me to introduce Melanie Revilla. She's one of the top, probably the most important assets and one of the top researchers in service methodology, and she's a sub-director of the RECSM with me, and I said I was explaining that she is actually collaborating. I'm very interested in many of the topics that she's working on, especially the topics related with her with the improvement of application of survey survey methods and survey methodology on new technologies and using new technologies, and especially I was also mentioning before in Spanish the work she's doing in one of my projects on a passive meter or behavioral tracker. So without further ado, I'm sorry for talking also in Spanish at the very beginning. So yes, I'll let her the floor. I'm sure you are much more interested in what she's going to say than I can say. So thank you, Melanie. Thank you for presenting here. Thank you for your work. And please start. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariano, and thank you everybody for assisting. So I'm really happy to be here today to speak about some of the work I've been doing lately, which is related to new opportunities to enhance or replace conventional web survey data. So first, I would like to say a little bit about why I think that we need to enhance this web survey data. So surveys, as you probably know, are the most frequently used methods to collect data in many disciplines, including political and social science. And the results, not always, but at least sometimes, might be used by key actors like governments to make really decisions and to decide, for instance, which kind of policy they want to implement. So the quality of the data that we get from the survey is really important because it can have really consequences. And within the world of surveys, the web survey became really more and more common. So for instance, in a report from ESOMAR already in 2019, they estimated that 35% of all the money that is spent on research is spent on research using mobile web versus only 11% for telephone and 8% for face-to-face. So web is really becoming the most important mode of data collection. And this was actually before the pandemic, but with the pandemic, we have also very large surveys like the ESS that started really thinking much harder and quicker about switching to web mode. So the web surveys are even more important nowadays than a couple of years ago. And the problem is that designing good surveys is really complicated. And in particular, in the case of web survey, because we do not have an interviewer that can help the respondents. So it means that we have really no control about what the respondents are doing. It could even be someone else that is answering the survey and we will not see it. It's also possible for the respondent just to randomly select some answers, and we also cannot really check that in a very serious way as if we have an interviewer. So the result is that when we use survey data, it is very well known that we have measurement errors and that we have also representation errors. There is actually a lot of knowledge about these errors. There is a total survey error framework that have been developed already years ago, and that is very famous, that will explain all the different kinds of errors that we have on both sides. So it's good because it means that there are errors, but we know a lot about them. So we also have some kind of control about which kind of errors we have and where they are. So I will not get into much details about all these errors, but just to say a little bit, on the representation side, we have more and more problems because it's really difficult to implement true random sampling. That would be what would help us getting really a representative sample of our target population. But in addition, even when we manage to get random sampling, the non-contact and the non-response became really huge in surveys nowadays, much more than what we had in the past. So for instance, in the European Social Survey, which is well known as the best, probably social science survey in Europe, or at least one of the best and highest quality survey, what they add is that in the last rounds, for instance, in Germany, the response rate are only around 30%. So we have 70% of the people that should answer that do not participate, which means that saying that our sample is representative of the target population, even if it's based on a random sampling, is very difficult because we can really expect that people that participate are different, at least on some key variables, from the ones that do not participate. So we have selection bias. And of course, there are some techniques to try to correct for that. So you can use, for instance, weighting. You can use propensity score as an example. But these techniques require to have extra information, for instance, about your population of interest. And sometimes it has been shown that implementing these techniques can lead to results that are even more biased than if you do not implement them. So it really depends how you implement them and the information you have to implement them. On the measurement side, we also have different kinds of problems. The first one is that we have some random errors just because people are making mistakes. Humans are making mistakes all the time. No? So there is this saying that to err is human, and just because of that, we will always have some errors. But besides these random errors, there are also a lot of systematic errors in surveys that can come from different sources. And for instance, one is quite famous, which is the social desirability bias, which is this tendency of people to try to present themselves in what they consider is the positive way for their reference group. So for instance, people tend to over-report things they think are seen well, like doing sports or eating vegetables, and they tend to under-report things like visiting adult websites or doing some illegal activities. And we also have problems and measurement errors in surveys sometimes because researchers want to ask too much from the respondents. So we tend as researchers to think that people will have an attitude, an opinion about everything we are interested in, and that we can always ask what we like and they will have something to say. But actually people very often, they do not know. And when it's about behaviors, really, it might be extremely problematic because they cannot just create the opinion in the moment. If it's about a behavior, they really need to have the information. So for instance, in one survey some time ago, I was asked the time I spend daily on WhatsApp. And that's really something I cannot tell. I go to WhatsApp maybe 30 times a day or more, I have no idea. And it's time for a few minutes, seconds, doing some other thing at the same time. So it's something I really cannot estimate properly. No? So because of all these reasons, and actually there are more, well, the result is that the measurement errors that we have in surveys, they are quite large. And actually, Carlos, that is sitting over there, is the first author of this paper in which we looked at the measurement quality of around 67 ESS questions in up to 41 country language groups. And what we find is that this quality is 0.65. What does it mean? Well, it means that the link between the concept of interest, so what really people want to measure, and the answer that they got in their questions is only 0.65 instead of being 1. So basically, the variance of the answers that we get in the survey, 65% come from this concept that we are trying to measure, and the remaining 35%, they are measurement errors. And of course, this has consequences on the results, not a race and not a race in the same direction, but sometimes this can lead to completely different conclusions. And here we have a short example where we did some regression analysis, and we find, for instance, that the impact of thinking that immigrants are an economic trait on saying that you would allow more immigrants to come and live in your country, it is negative and significant if we use the data as they are, so without correcting for these measurement errors, but it becomes 0.001 and it's not significant anymore if we do some corrections for the measurement errors of this variable. So clearly here, if we use the data as they are without corrections, we will have a wrong decision and the wrong conclusions on this data. And this is what's happening in many cases. No? So I think that overall, it's quite clear for people at least working in methodology that we need to improve the measurements of many of the concepts that we are currently measuring through conventional survey data and in particular web surveys. And there is a lot of work that was done already in that direction. So that's not something new. We know that for years and we are working on that for years. And we have, I said it before, a lot of knowledge already. So for instance, we know we should not use agree-disagree questions, or we should avoid check all that apply questions. So there is this knowledge, but this knowledge was applied in the ESS, and we still see that the measurement quality is around 0.64. So it means that we should try to go in different directions than what was done so far. And that's what I wanted to propose so in my ERC project. So my idea was try to go in a slightly different direction, which is take advantage of new measurement opportunities that are linked mainly to the growing presence of smartphone to reduce these measurement errors that we observe in web surveys for several and many, I would say, concepts. So I decided to focus on smartphones because they were really everywhere. No? So actually there are some blog posts saying, I'm not sure if the information is reliable or not, but they say that there are more people having smartphones than toilets access worldwide. And if smartphones are everywhere, they are also in surveys, of course. So we did a study a few years ago in the US NetQuest panel. We find that the millennials, they answer almost 80% of the surveys using smartphone. And even the boomers, they answer more than 1/3 of the survey using smartphone. So really, if you are doing a web survey, you will have mobile respondents, and a large part of them would be mobile respondents. And this creates new challenges because the comparability of the data between respondents answering from PC and from smartphone is not obvious and is actually not at all guaranteed, but it also provides some new opportunities. And that's what I want to focus on. So there are different opportunities at different levels. One would be, for instance, to contact the respondent. If respondents are using the smartphone, you can easily invite them to a web survey by just sending a WhatsApp or an SMS. So that's a nice way to invite people to web survey that was not present before. But my focus is on the new kinds of data that we can very easily collect from smartphones, and that could replace or be combined with the data that we get from conventional web surveys. So this data comes from the different sensors that we have on the phones, in particular the camera, or the GPS, or the microphone, and the fact that we can also install some apps on these devices. So more precisely, I'm working on metadata that Mariano mentioned already before. So metadata basically are obtained through a tracking application that is called a Meta, that is installed by the participants on their browsing devices. So it can be PC, tablet, or smartphones. And that registers at least the URL of the web page that they are visiting. So you can check all the online activity that they are doing. Then I'm also interested in geolocation data, but not by itself, as you will see in a moment. So geolocation data basically correspond to the GPS coordinates of the people, or the device that the people are using more precisely. But I'm using the geolocation data to look at in-the-moment surveys that are triggered by this kind of data. So I'm interested in the moment survey triggered both by metadata and geolocation data. By in-the-moment surveys, we mean surveys that are sent just after an event of interest occurred. So the idea is that we can reduce issues that are related with human memory limitation by asking just after the event, and not something like, did you do something in the last 3 months, and try to remember what you did. But just after it occurred, we will ask you, how was your experience about that? And maybe some very concrete fact, like how much do you pay, or how did you like it, or whatever. I'm also working on visual data that includes screenshots, photo and videos that are taken in the moment from the device, and visual files that could be saved on that device or accessible from that device. And finally, I'm working with voice data that include both dictation. So people speak, and like right now, the text is immediately transcribed on the screen. And what the researcher gets is this text. And voice recording, in which people speak also, but what the researcher gets is the recording of the voice and not just the transcription of the text. And it's important to mention that most of this data, actually all except the geolocation data, that can also be collected from PC. So even if I said that the idea of the ERC came from the growing presence of smartphone, at the end, the research is not limited to smartphone. People that are answering from PC or that participate from PC can also be included, because most of the data types can also be collected from the PCs. And all this kind of data, they are actually used already in practice for some years in substantive research. For instance, regarding the metadata, there are already more than 60 papers that are using metadata in political and social science. And they mainly look at things like fake news conceptions or media diet, these kind of topics. And the other types of data also have been used in practice. So I'm saying new data, but they are not really new by themselves. I think what is new is the fact that we are looking at this data from a methodological point of view and try to see which kind of errors they have, which kind of limitations, which kind of benefits, etc. So coming to this, what are the potential benefits of these kinds of data? Well, there are expected benefits first on the researcher side. And the first one is that we expect that with this kind of data, we can reduce some of the issues that I mentioned before that are related to measurement errors. So for instance, the time you spend on WhatsApp, if you can observe that using a meter, this should be much better than if you ask people. Or if you're interested in people having dangerous moles, probably people, they don't know if they didn't check with a doctor if some of their moles are dangerous. But you could ask them to send pictures, and an expert could code these pictures and could say if someone has or not some dangerous moles. Similarly, I mentioned the problem of social desirability before. And we expect that social desirability is still possible, of course, with this kind of data, but should be lower, because presenting yourself in a more positive way means really changing your behavior. For instance, for the metadata, if you do not want people to know that you visit adult website, you really need to stop doing it, or doing it from devices that are not tracked, otherwise they will see it. So it means really more effort than just say, no, I don't do it in a survey. Or if you're interested in, for instance, knowing if people have some illegal plants in their garden, if you ask for a series of plants, do you have them? Yes or no? It's very easy to say just no, even if you have it. But if you just ask without more context, actually, please send me pictures of your garden, it's much more probably that they don't think about this issue and they just send pictures in which you could detect this kind of presence. We also expect these new data types to provide a larger amount of data. So for the metadata, this is very clear. No, you can get a URL per second, and I don't know how many days. So it's really a huge database. But even for the visual data, well, the famous adage says it, no, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And for voice data, you also expect people to speak more than if they have to type in answers. So you expect also more data. And information from the voice itself can also be an extra data that you use to look at emotions, for instance, when people are speaking, or levels of education that you could detect in having some tones of voice, etc. And this kind of data, they also provide at least the metadata and the GPS data, actually, data that is continuously normally collected. So it means that you get the data in real time and you get data for every hour or every day. So when there is a kind of shock or crisis and you want to look at the evolution on the short term, this is very interesting because for instance, the metadata, they are collected out there. They exist already because they are method panel that collect this information continuously. So for instance, when the war in Ukraine started, if you wanted to see how people change their looking online for Russia or Ukraine, or look where it is or what's happening there, you could look at what they did just before and what they did in the first days of war and how this is evolving. And these data are already collected. So you can think about it later, but still use some kind of data that was more from a past period. So it allows at the end to answer some kind of new research questions. Now, on the participant side, we also have several expected benefits, which are mainly related with the reduction of time and or efforts to answer. So, of course, this is not the case for all the concepts. If you want to know the age of the person, asking to type in the age would be much quicker and less effort than if you ask for a photo of their ID card. No, that's clear. But we can think at several examples. For instance, if you would like to know the diet of people, what they eat, instead of asking them to type in all the products that they have in their fridge, it would be much less effort in principle to just send a picture of that. And if you want even more details, for instance, you want to know what are the ingredients in each of the food product they buy, well, again, asking for images from that should be much easier for the respondents than if they have to type in that the saturated fat is what, and etc. And we also expect it to be more enjoyable because these things are used by people. So people outside the survey world, they are sending images to their friends in WhatsApp, they are sending voice messages. So we do expect that people have this tendency of using that and that they would like to use that. Now, unfortunately, there are, of course, some disadvantages as well. So we also expect on the researcher side that the selection will be higher. So first, we expect a lower participation than for conventional surveys. And we expect that the people that accept to participate to such sharing of other kinds of data will be maybe even more specific than the one that accept to participate to web surveys. We also said that we could reduce probably some kind of errors, but there are also new errors that will appear, or at least be much more important than in the past, in particular technological errors. So all this kind of data collection depends really on the device and how you can collect this information. Now, on the researcher side, it might also be more effort, at least for now, because you need to have some tools to do this data collection, and they are not always easy to use or available, and you need to have the skills to analyze these new kinds of data. So it means also more effort, and it means sometimes dependence on private company who have the tools and that can sell you the data. And my final point is about data protection issues and ethical issues. I think that's always a problem when you are doing data collection, but if you use this passively collected data in particular, then it's even more complicated to make sure that you have really an informed consent. So people really realize what they are sharing with you and consent being informed of what they are doing. And even in the case, for instance, of images, that's also the case, because it's quite easy if you ask for a picture, for instance, of the living room, to send a picture and do not realize that maybe over there is a paper, and on that there is actually a phone number of someone, and this is private information and I should not share it, but I didn't realize that this was on the picture. So it's also more difficult to protect this data, and that's why on the participant side we have the other end, which is that we have more privacy issues that are mentioned by participants, due also to this loss of control of what exactly is shared. And we also have new skills needed on the participant side. So overall, this was like the expected things, but what's happening in practice? Well, that's the goal of the ERC, to provide more information that will help at the end answering these kind of questions together with more research, because this is a very complex question. So we will need much more research to answer such a question. So for now, I cannot provide an answer, but we would like to get information to be able to say if really the expected benefits are or not occurring in practice, and if the benefits are really higher than the disadvantages. No? So that's the kind of questions we would like at the end to answer. But for doing that, we need first more information about the different kinds of data, the errors they have. And we need to think also, I had that on the previous slide actually, we need to think that there will not be a general answer to this kind of questions ever. No, what we need to look is for a specific concept of interest, for a specific type of data, for a specific way of using this kind of data, for a specific target population, etc. Then we can answer if it is beneficial or not, but not in general. So it's clear that it's not something that will replace all survey questions. Survey will survive and they will be there probably for many more years. But it could be that for some concept, and we need to identify which one, then it makes sense to using this kind of data. So the research that I've been doing lately, and I'm still doing, and I plan to do for the next couple of years, is focused in trying to provide information that will help answering this kind of questions at the end. So I will try to give you a short overview going for each of the different source of data about the kind of things we did. It will be very quick about each point, so it's really an overview, but if you're interested then in some points, we can discuss them further or in the question or later on for the people interested. So in terms of metadata, the first things we did was creating a framework of error that is similar to the total survey errors, but is focused on adapting this framework to metadata. So at the end, we have a list, and it's not complete. There are more errors than that list all the different kinds of errors that you may have and their causes for metadata. And I think that's really useful because I said before, there are over 60 papers already using metadata and none of them is mentioning the errors of this data. So they all consider that the metadata is a gold standard that will provide information about online behaviors. And they do not realize, or they don't want to realize, I don't know, that there are actually a lot of different errors and we need to learn more about these errors. So in the second step, once we had done the framework, what we did, Mariano mentioned that we are collaborating in his project, the Triple project. What we did is using the framework together with Oriol Bosch to design the data collection strategy of this project, in which we have both survey data and metadata. So we tried for each of the steps to see how we can minimize the different source of errors that will have the data, and also how we can estimate the size of the remaining errors. So in particular, we focused on the idea of tracking under coverage, because we have to realize that the meta is installed for a given device, a given browser, and a given network. So it means that the information that we observe for an individual, if the person is going online with different devices, and within each device is using different browsers, and within each browsers is using different networks, probably the meta will allow us to get information from some of them, but not all of them, because to get all the information, we would need the person to really install different tracking technologies in the different device, in the different browsers, etc. So overall, we are very often in a situation like this one, where part of the things are not observed. So if I want to measure the time people spend online, I said it might be better to use the meta because people don't know. Yes, but if we are really measuring everything they do online, otherwise this estimate will be also completely underestimated. So in this first paper, what we try to do is see what are the proportion of people that have that are undercovered, and we find actually, this is this number here, that we have from 80 to 85% of the participants that are at least undercovered in some of their device browsers or networks. So really, this is a huge problem, and this should be taken into account. We also worked using the same data on estimating the student, convergent and predictive validity of the concept, because if you use metadata in the same way as if you use survey data, you start with your concept and you operationalize this concept, but now it's not a question, it's a measurement that will be based on the metadata. But you need to take decisions in the same way as you do with survey. For instance, in this paper, we focus on online news media exposure. So if you want to measure such a concept, you need to decide which URL will be considered as a news media exposure and which URL will not be considered as being news. So you need to find a list of all the URL that will be considered as news. And there are different lists out there, and they are not exactly the same. So you need to decide which list to use and how many of this media you will count when you are computing the exposure to media that people are looking at online. And you also need to decide, for instance, how many days of metadata do I use? Do I use 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month? How many data do I need? In surveys, we often solve this problem by saying, on average, but on average, if you use metadata, you need to decide on what you compute your average. So what we did in this paper is try to vary all these decisions and see the final measurement, how much they differ the one for the other and how much they relate with really the concept we are interested in. Moving to in the moment surveys, the first things we did was creating a tool, because in the moment survey already existed for a long time, but in the moment survey triggered by passive data, there were almost nothing existing out there. So we created a tool, but the tool cannot be used just by itself. So it's a tool that has to be integrated in a panel management system, and then it can be used to trigger the survey when you observe that someone is visiting a website of interest. So let's say they visit the website of a political party, then you could send the survey just after that to these people. Or for the geolocation data, you see that the people are visiting a place of interest, then you send them the survey of interest. And then we also worked on the invitation, because in the moment survey, the idea is that we want people to be invited just after the event occurred, but we also want them to answer as soon as possible, such that there is no issue with memory, etc. But it means that if they need to answer, they need first to see the invitation. And seeing the invitation in the short time is not something that is guaranteed. It really depends on the kind of target population you have also, but it's something that is not guaranteed. So we worked a little bit more in trying to identify which kind of invitation methods which would be accepted by people and which one would be seen the first by the people. So we asked people what they thought in an online panel, and we found that the mobile app seems to be the best option, both in terms of people accepting and seeing it first. But we also saw that adding more contact method, invitation methods, is really helpful in principle to get a better potential participation. And then we didn't move directly to experiment, because designing this kind of experiment is extremely complicated. You have to make a lot of decisions about how you will do the survey, and we didn't have any information from the literature on that. So we did a first step in which we used some conjoint experiments in which we asked people if they would participate in different in the moment survey that have different characteristics. So for instance, the time you have to participate might be just 1 hour after getting the invitation, or it might be 2 hours, or it might be 6 hours, or the length of the survey might be just 1 minute, or it might be up to 20 minutes. So we varied these kind of things to see how this is impacting, and also the incentive, to see how this is impacting the willingness to participate in such study, and get an idea of what we could propose then in practice that would lead to the highest participation possible. And we did that both for in the moment survey that are triggered by metadata and by geolog data. And overall, what we found is that the willingness to participate in the moment survey is really very high. What is problematic is the first step. It's sharing the data, the passive data that will be used to trigger the survey. But if people accept to share the geolog data, or if they accept to share the metadata, then they normally accept also to participate in the moment survey. But we do find also some difference across different incentives. So for instance, higher incentives lead to higher participations, etc. And so the next step is, of course, to implement really experiments, and we already started, but just a little bit working on that. But we expect that we will have a lot of practical issues, and that people may not have realized that it's so complicated to answer a survey in the moment, but when they get the survey and they were just outside of the supermarket, maybe then they will not see or not participate, no? The next one is the visual data. So in that case also we started, we started by the second one, which is implementing some experiments, but then we created a tool, which might seem a bit strange, but it's because we did the experiments in the past with a private company that had the tool, but there were no tool that was available for people out there. So when we started with the ERC and we had finally some money, we first created a tool, and then we will do some new experiments, but the one I'm presenting are actually were done before the tool. So the tool actually allows people to share visual data that is already saved on their device by drag and drop, or by looking for the file, or by copy pasting, and to share data also that is produced during the survey with the camera of the device. They can take a picture, or they can make a video and share it with the researcher. And as I said, the experiments were done before the tool, so we cannot really see if the tool is working properly or not. But what we found with this previous experiment was actually not as encouraging as we would like. So we asked people to share images really in surveys, and we find that only around 50% really sent images that were in line with the questions, which was lower than what we would like, because we would like to have something more similar to the participation in a normal text questions, let's say. And we also find, and this was a bit surprising, that respondents did not like it so much. So there were the two things that we were not really in line with our expectations. But again, it was before the new tool, so it might be that some things are improved. And also we tried to understand better what was happening. So now what we started to do is try to disentangle why people would not send the images when we ask them. And we look if it is because they don't have the skills, or because they don't want to do it, they are not willing, or because they find it too burdensome, or because the data is not available to them. So actually a lot of people, that's what we find, say that they don't have visual data saved on the device they are using to answer the survey, so they could not share it. Or they said they are not in a situation when answering the survey of making the pictures. For instance, they're answering from work and they cannot just start making pictures and sending them. And they do not want to come back to the survey later on, which would be an option, but they don't want to do this effort because then it will be more burden. And we need to do more experiments, but they are not yet done. What we did instead was started working already on how to extract the information from the images, because if you ask for images, you could get very rich information, but first you need to be able to extract this information. And depending how you do this extraction, the quality of the information might be very different. No? So we worked on a small guide for people that are not very used to this kind of new data on how you can do the data collection and the classification of the data that you have in the images. And finally, for the voice data, well, again, we created a tool that allows to do both the dictation and the recording of the voice answers. But again, this was done actually after having already implemented some experiments in which, again, the results were not as encouraging as we would like, because first we got, in this case, a lot of technical issues, in particular because for using dictation of voice, people need to allow to use the microphone. So they get a pop-up or something in their phone asking if you allow to use the microphone. And a lot of people or ignore it, or didn't understand it, or didn't want already at this step. And then, as I said, it was also not working. No? And also respondents did not like it that much. So for instance, in the second paper I'm quoting here, we find that actually only between 20 and 30% of the respondents said that they like answering by speaking instead of typing in the answers. So again, we tried to disentangle a little bit what's happening. So in that case, we did it a bit differently. We tried different conditions in terms of different instructions, different feedback that is provided to the respondent. We also try to measure the preference of the respondents for speaking versus writing, and we try to see what's happening and why not more people like or do participate in this kind of ways. But again, we need more experiments, and this is all work in progress. No? So this was a very quick summary of the different lines in which we are working. And as I said before, if you want to know more, I'm very happy to speak more about some of the aspects that might be more interesting for you. And also, if you think that your research could really use some of these new data types, so if you try to measure concepts that would be good candidates for this kind of research, I would be very happy to speak about potential collaborations. So at that point, what is the plan for what is coming? Well, I said that we still have a lot to be done, and that if we want to answer these kind of questions I mentioned before, there are research in all kinds of directions that is needed. But what I would like to focus on is learning more really about the errors of this data, because I think also visual data, for instance, are used more and more, like the metadata, but people normally ignore the problem. So I want to focus on what is ignored by the substantive researcher, which are the errors, what are their size, how this is affecting the results in different concepts, different situations, different target population, etc. I think it's also needed always to understand really when it is useful and it makes sense to use this kind of data. So we need to know more first about benefits and disadvantage and the mechanism that are behind to understand what's going on and be able to say, okay, in that case, it will make sense to do it and in another it won't. And finally, I think we also need really to work on how we will use this data, because so far I was mainly speaking in terms of some questions could be replaced by this kind of new data types. But in fact, I think the most interesting part is to combine this data with the conventional survey questions. And if we think in terms of combining, then we need to say how we want to combine them, because there are a lot of different possibilities. So if we think in terms of metadata and conventional survey questions, for instance, we can use the metadata to trigger an in-the-moment survey. I mentioned this as an option before. But we could also say that we use the metadata to study the behavior of people when they're answering the survey. In particular, there are a lot of research that look at knowledge questions. They ask, for instance, about political knowledge. They want to assess the political knowledge of people. Well, if you do that in a web survey, you don't know if people don't just Google the answers and provide the right answer because they search for it, or if it is really that they knew before. So if you are combining metadata with survey data, well, you can check if during the survey they were looking on Google or whatever else for the answer or not, no? As long as, of course, they use a device that has the meta installed also for looking for the answers. And we could also think about combining the two measures in terms of the difference between the two can be helpful. So for instance, if people say, no, I didn't see this advertisement, but the metadata said, yes, the person saw this advertisement, and you are sure that this is not because all the other kind of different errors we have in the data, well, the difference between the two is informative. It means that the ad was not working. So people saw it, but they don't remember about it. So this is additional information that can also be useful. And of course, it could also be used just in a more simple model in which you have a latent variable, and then instead of just one measure, you have two measures, so you can estimate the errors of the different measures as well. So getting to the conclusions, I think we really need more research in terms of both methodological research and practical applications as well. And I hope there are potentially broad applications, even if, again, it's also not something that will replace all survey questions, for sure, not even half of them. It's still a small proportion of all the survey questions, but since there are so many surveys, this small proportion still means broad applications, I think, and of course, new insights. But I think we should also remember that even if we try to do our best with survey or with the new type of data or with any kind of data collection, there will always be errors. So we should live with that somehow, no? And I always like the example of the temperature, because I have a baby at home. And when I'm trying to get the temperature of the baby, I always, when I try the thermometer 3 times, get 3 different numbers. So I thought, okay, let me buy another one because this thermometer is not good. I bought a second thermometer. I take 3 times the temperature. I still gave 3 different numbers from the 3 different ones. So I thought I will buy one that is really specific for baby. And now you have a third thermometer at home. It's still 3 different numbers. No, so I think we should realize that if we are not able to measure something like the temperature, which should be something really objective and kind of obvious, how can we measure without error something like the trust you have in a political institution at the European level that people may not even know about, no? So my view on that is that it's really not realistic to aim for perfect measures. So even if surveys have a quality that might not be as high as we would like, well, that's already maybe more than other types of data. And we can, and we should actually try to minimize these errors, but we know that we will still have errors. So we also need to correct for these errors. And there are some procedures, and William Saris, that was working at this university for several years, worked a lot in that direction on how to do the corrections for measurement errors. However, we should also know that even if we correct for measurement errors, the corrected results are still not the correct results, because there are errors in the estimation of the errors and in the procedures for correcting for measurement errors. So at the end, even the corrected results are not the true value. So I think we need to live with that and be honest with ourselves and with our readers that there will be errors in the data. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to think always about the consequence of that, because we cannot avoid having these errors. And one way that I think is also particularly promising is that since there are always errors, we should try to look from different perspectives as often as we can, so we can get different but complementary information. And I will finish with this parable that I really like. I don't know if you know it, the blind man and the elephant. So there are different versions of it, but to make it short, different blind men were asked what an elephant looked like. They never looked at an elephant before, so they touched the elephant, and each one was touching a different part. So the one that touched the side said that it was like a wall, and the one that was touching the nose said that it was like a snake, and etc. So actually each one was partially right, but they were also all wrong at the same time. But if you put all the information together, then you start having a full picture of what an elephant looked like. And I think with any kind of concept we might be interested in measuring, we should, as often as possible, try different kinds of data collections, different types of data, so we get information that each time we'll have errors, but when we put all of it together, we start getting a better picture of what is the reality. And that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for listening, and any questions are welcome.
Okay, no questions on the floor. Thank you, Melanie, for this amazing presentation once more. Yeah, it's a pleasure always listen to you, even though we work together in some of these topics. I mean, you work in my project and help me to think about all of this. It's an incredible challenge. I mean, I have some questions, some comments to make, but I'm sure there are people out there that could also ask you questions. So anybody wants to ask a question? If somebody's out from the audience, please use a microphone so everybody can hear you.
Yes, we have several in the room, so let's start in the room, okay?
I don't know if it's working yet.
Yeah.
Thank you, Melanie, for presenting your research to us. You really open our mind to see many possibilities, although I find that the use of phones looks very intrusive, very difficult issue. But I have some questions or comments. The first question is, well, from the social science perspective, I was thinking, for instance, in the time use data, and I wonder whether you have any other alternative from your new site, whether we can have better data collection using these new technologies, because it's really time demanding and difficult to collect all this information every 10 minutes. You also mentioned that these agree-disagree questions never doesn't work. Why these questions don't work? I would like to hear your opinion. And the issue of social desirability, yeah, this is a big issue, but I don't see how can you really overcome this problem with these new technologies, because after all, what you are looking is like, for instance, values or ideology. How can you really grasp this sort of information with these new technologies, which are basically quantitative? I don't know. Yeah, I pass the micro to Clara.
Maybe I answer first.
Oh, yes,
no?
wherever
Okay.
you want. Yeah, thank you.
So we start with the agree-disagree because it's a bit less the topic, but I think it's interesting. Well, agree-disagree scales have been shown to have really a much lower quality than all other kinds of questions. And there are different reasons. One is the acquiescence bias. So people tend to agree with any kind of statement that they are proposed. So if you use the statement and you say, men are better than women at teaching, more people will agree than the one that really think that. And if you put women are better than men, more people will agree than the one that really think that. But if you use agree-disagree, you have to select one statement. Instead, if you use what is called item specific, which would be the alternative questions, you can balance your questions. You can ask, do you think that men are better, worse, or equal at teaching than women? Or you can put women first if you want. No? So in that way, you don't have this acquiescence bias that is occurring so much. And beside that, if you are using this agree-disagree scale, you also have one more cognitive step actually for people to answer. So first, if you ask men are better than women at teaching, agree or disagree, first you need to think, what do you think? No, I think that they are equal. And then you still need to think, how do I translate that on an agree-disagree scale? So it's one more step that you avoid when you use item specific. And the results are quite clear, actually. There is a lot of literature that then shows that you should avoid these scales. No? Regarding the social desirability, well, my examples were more, not so much about attitudes and opinions, but about behaviors that are also normally the one that really are over or underreported in social desirable or sensitive questions. No? So there is quite some interest about behaviors as well, and behaviors that are known as being seen positively by the society. People tend to say they do it. Like if you ask, do you watch your teeth every day? They will all say yes, even if it's not true, these kind of things. No? So it's also important to get right information for behaviors, I think. And so if you ask people about images, or about if you use the passive data even more, that's really more difficult to think each time you are doing something that you think should not be seen, that you should stop doing it. No, maybe if you are doing the data collection for one day, but with metadata, people are there for months. So they would really need to change their behaviors and take new ways of doing things such that you cannot see it. And actually, for instance, with adult website, if you look at the data, it's everywhere. So it seems that people do not try to hide this kind of behaviors when they are in a method panel. No. And the last one was, well, the first one actually was about the time use. Well, the time use, you can, well, depends about if you want to really know everything they do, you mean in their day. No. So it could be useful already to have the metadata. So each time they start something online, this information, you will have it. And at least for the online period, they will not have to estimate them. So, I mean, with all the time that we all spend online, that's already a big part of our days. No, see, if already you can detect that. And for instance, you also have meters for TV. So you could also use a meter for the TV. So also when they watch the TV, they would not have to estimate, but this would be something you could detect. And then you can also use the geolog data to complete this. No? So if you see, for instance, that they start moving, they are probably traveling. No? So with the GPS data, you could also, so it might probably not replace the full time use diary, but it could feel part of the information. And you could ask people just actually they did it, not just to confirm. So for instance, I detected that you were moving from that to that. Is it really that you were moving? And then they don't have to estimate the time. No, you put the time and they just have, yeah, this morning I was indeed traveling. That's true. No, so they have to confirm instead of putting the numbers, which is very often difficult. So it can help, maybe not replace, but I think it can still help. No? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. Yeah, I was also thinking that your presentation is a challenge for all of us, because you're asking us to make the effort of thinking differently and thinking whether the concepts we are interested in can be measured differently. And so I will try to do this effort. But in order to start, maybe I would like to know whether you think that objective concepts or subjective ones can be better measured with this type of new data sources or data collections, because I think that it really makes a difference whether you are asking for a subjective thing or an objective one. So this to start with, and then in the subjective box, I think we have different things. We have like attitudes and values and this kind of thing. Here, I clearly see your point and the potential benefits. But then we have something else. For example, I was thinking on a concept or several concepts that I have been interested in, like, for example, discrimination experiences or victimization, everything that has to do with having experienced. Yeah, and this is subjective, but it's not an attitude. It has to do with how did you perceptions, no, about circumstances or things you have gone through. And I don't know, in relation with this type of concepts, what do you think the potentialities are? And yeah, and of course I will try to think about behaviors and about, for example, working conditions or demographic histories. And here I'm not I will think about it, but about discrimination, victimization, maybe you have already some clues.
Yeah, thank you. So the data depends on the type of data. So it's a bit difficult because I try to speak about the 4 of them, but they are very different also in some aspects. If we think about the metadata, for instance, it's clear that we get mainly information about behaviors. No, we see what people do online. But from this information, we can also extrapolate to some subjective variable. For instance, they use this data already, in this paper that already exists, to see the left-right positionment of people. So if they are reading mainly newspapers that are from left, they conclude that they are left-oriented, even if it might not be true. They might want to read what the other thinks, but you can do this kind of extrapolation from objective to some subjective, but it's true that it's mainly about the objective. No? If we think about the in-the-moment surveys, they are really thought actually to compensate somehow the fact that with the passive data, you are mainly on the objective side. So Carlos is actually the one doing the PhD on that. But the idea really of doing the in the moment is to ask about these perceptions right after they occur, no? Because it's well done also. It was on the slide, but I didn't mention it for time issues. But it's known that first, people do not remember well what they did, but also that they remember differently than what really they experienced. So they say that the experiencing self is not the same as the remembering self. So what we measure in survey is usually the remembering self, but this is very different from the experiencing one. So the typical example is the way you remember the day you got birth to your kids, no, is different from the way you really lived it, no, and that's why people have more than one kids, probably, otherwise they would stop, no, after the first one. So if you do the survey just in the moment, just when they got the kid, and you ask about their perceptions of this experience, this is probably very different than if you ask about 3 months later. So how was it when you got the kid? No, so this could be used for this kind of thing. And I think the mention of discrimination is something also, you leave it in the moment and maybe later on you do not, I mean, depends, no, but if you have a specific discrimination at a specific event, you may forget about it if it's not something very habitual or not, or at least your memory might change the memories about this discrimination event. So asking about specific event, if they felt discriminated or this kind of things, probably would be really useful, no, in this direction. So that would be what I think of like immediately.
Reason to find new methods to collect data is because, as you say, to increase the response rates and minimize the burden on the respondents. But also another reason is money, that to find cheaper ways to get the data. And when you listed the disadvantages of these methods, you mentioned they're more expensive. So don't you think that this could be some sort of a critical like challenge, no? That if we have to move to technologies that are more expensive, that could probably not help to the transition, no?
Well, I think most of the disadvantages actually, they are what we have right now. But if we go in that direction, they will disappear. No? So for now, it might be more expensive. I say it mainly because, for instance, if you want metadata, and Mariano knows better the price than me because he was leading this project, but it gets very expensive to buy this metadata from the private company that have these panels. But this is because the technology is still not very common and there are few panels, so they can also increase the price. And if you would have some, as we try to do, no, for the other ones, so we try to develop some tools that are available for free, then this becomes cheap again, no? And for instance, our tools, I said that right now you still need to integrate them in a kind of other survey software. This step is not yet done, but once it will be done, so someone else put some money and do it, then it could be used for free, no? If you put the possibility of using this kind of tools in a tool that is by itself already free or the same price, you will have also these options. No? So I think we have a cost to get into that, and the same for the analysis. No? So I said, now we need new skills for analysis, but once we will have done it, this will be one more skill that we will have in our CV. No? So this is a kind of in the transition step, but then if we start using them, it will not be there. And it's the same on the participant side. So now, for instance, we find also that it was longer for people to share the images, but also because we compared to a simple question. That's the first point, but also because it was the first time probably they were asked during the survey with this specific tool to share the image. So they didn't know exactly how it works. But if it would be that every week they would get this kind of questions, then they will get used to it, and then they will be much quicker for sure. No, so that's also one of the limits of, and that's why, I mean, the research was not as encouraging as we would like, but also we focused on panels where people are really used to some specific task and mainly answering conventional surveys. So they are really expert on that. And we have something new and different. So of course, there is a kind of shock, but if they would be asked all the time for the other things, they will become also expert in the other things, and probably they will not have the same issues as in a first contact. No? So that's why we are still optimistic about the possibility of using all these things. No?
Can I say something about this, Melanie? Oh. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. When you say more expensive, it's relative. Yeah. I think that Melanie meant more. Obviously, it's more expensive to do this kind of apply this kind of technology to an online survey. Compare if you only do the online survey, but let's be realistic. If you want to also improve the quality of offline service, in other words, face-to-face, that is very, very much more expensive than anything else. So in a way of cost, I mean, you want to improve quality means spending more money, obviously. But one thing is that I mean, one of the problems with the European Social Survey is it's just extremely expensive. Because it's much more costly to obtain a very good face-to-face survey than anything else. So the question is, this is a different alternative to measure, and we have to go in that direction to improve and think about all of this. See, Melanie gave a very good examples of that. Another example that I use a passive meter too is also something is experiment compliance. So, you know, we normally rely on asking the people, oh, have you done this? Have you done that? But with the passive meter, and she mentioned that because it's in the project, I use that too for that purpose as well. I know if people went to that place, if they stay in Twitter, why they did, so or where they go. So with geolocation and everything, so I know exactly based on that information if people are compliant or not to the specific survey experiment, which is a good thing about this. But also, well, I mean, she's the expert. We have been talking about this over and over and over many times, and I read his papers and this kind of stuff. But there is a lot of potential problems, but it is a lot of possibilities with this kind of applying this kind of technology. And it's true, and I would say Maria Jose said it's intrusive, but the difference is that here I'm telling you, because also I spent hours, and Melanie knows about that too, that we spent hours and hours and hours discussing with the committee about confidentiality and ethics and on and on. I had to fill up papers and papers and papers of what I'm going to do and who's going to be stored this data and this kind of stuff. But let's be realistic. All the private companies are already collecting that information for us, and nobody's asking where what they're doing with that information and where they store that information. And this is a big issue. So at least, you know, social scientists, you know, they are following the protocol that seems to be good and asking for a good purpose. And also we are triple check every time we try to design this kind of surveys, and Melanie knows that very well as well. So yeah, I mean, it's an issue of intrusion, but we have to be realistic as well about that. You know, just too different a little bit what Melanie is doing, which also I'm aware of many. We discussed also some problematic issues with the application of this methodology, which she explained very well.
One question, because I'm a bit ignorant of this methodology, but in traditional surveys, you would receive a letter from the Ministry of Education, whatever, and they say it is your obligation to participate in this survey, and then you fill up the survey. With these new methodologies of collecting data, I'm very much concerned with the selection bias of the people, because I guess you are leaving out working class who are not confident or they are not willing to share, and the more educated, like I would think twice whether I will give access to anyone to my mobile phone. So to what extent, in terms of sample, are we getting a poor or real representation of the population? Thank you.
Well, that's a huge question. Not that's a good question. We do expect selection bias, of course, with these new methods. That was one of the disadvantages listed. But I think here we should also not be too critical, because we should realize that most of the research that is already done has already a huge bias. No, that's why I mentioned this response rate in the European Social Survey. So if you have only a response rate of 30%, even if you started with a random sample, you have a selection bias. And it's not clear if it will be higher or not than with this kind of new data. We need more research comparing the different kinds of samples, no? And there is already some research, but for instance, the online panel, they have been already compared to, for instance, the ESS in terms of composition and some things like that, no? And they found that there are, for instance, less old, very old people that are participating in the web survey than in the ESS. But on the other end, they also find that some other category of people that were not well represented in the ESS are sometimes better represented in the online panel. So it's very difficult to generalize because it depends the variables that you are more interested in and which one you compare. But for instance, when this opt-in panel started, a lot of research focused on that, no? And they started thinking we should not use opt-in panel, and then they compare them to other panels, probability-based online or to other surveys like the ESS. And at the end, I think the results were quite encouraging. So it means that on some variables, it's true, you might be really underrepresenting people like over 85, for instance, but on other variables, it was doing better. And if you have the information also, you can correct for that. So you can do some weighting procedures to make your sample more representative of your population. And I think also we should realize that even if maybe in academic, not that much, but still a lot of research is not interested in the general adult population, but in specific population. So for instance, I was teaching at ESADE this month, and there nobody's interested in general population. They are all interested in people that have a small business from 20 to 50%, or someone that works and has a company in a manufacturer. I don't know, because I didn't understand much their problems. It's really far from my topic, but really, I was actually presenting my course more in terms like here at the department, more people would be interested in general population. And they were all PhD students, so really working on papers with surveys, so very interested. We discussed all their topic. None of them was interested in the general population. And this is because it's more from business perspective, but it's happening in a lot of different disciplines also. I was discussing just yesterday also with someone to try to collaborate, because I said I'm really open to collaborations right now. And actually this was one of the problems, because I said I want to try my tools also for the general population, at least the general online population as we have it in the panels. And she was interested only in people that have a person in their family that is in a house for old people. So that was actually a problem for collaborating in the project, and we have to think about a different way of doing it. So, I mean, there are a lot of people that are not interested in the general population, and then you cannot have very often a good frame to invite these people in a random way. So you need to rely on quotas or other things. And then that's the same if you're asking for different tools or for just a survey. And the number I showed also at the beginning, this 35% of research is already using mobile web. And from this mobile web, maybe 5% is probability based, but at least 30% will be that is opt-in panels or non-probability samples. So, I mean, we are already in a reality where a lot of research is not probability based. And when it is, again, if the response rate is 30%, you also cannot assume that this is representative. So we need to look at this weighting very carefully, see which variables we can put, try to get information from the one that do not respond. So at least, for instance, you do not want to share this data, but could you at least give me information about age, gender, education, the variables that you think could be really important, so you can use this information for doing some corrections, something like that, no?
I'm sorry, just a very quick thing. You say there's a lot of research based on surveys which are no longer probabilistic or based on a probabilistic sample. And when they are, the response rate is so low that you cannot even be sure about representativity. But I was wondering, for example, labor force surveys, which are conducted everywhere in Europe in a standardized way and everything through statistical offices. Do we know the response rate of this type of surveys?
Well,
I would say they are higher, much higher, maybe because they are, I mean, the resources invested in obtaining responses are also higher. So my point is, I still think that this is can be very beneficial for specific topics, for specific population, but I think we can still trust traditional and strong and very reliable surveys such as time use surveys, labor force surveys, fertility surveys. I don't know. Do you agree on
the response?
Am I wrong, or because otherwise
you should not trust them
I will panic
too much. I think that's the same kind as the ESS. Well, I showed Germany in the ESS because this is the worst country. No, in all countries the objective is a 70% response rate. And I would say that more than half of them, they meet this. So most of them have around 70% response rate. Some even do better sometimes, but still Germany, it's not the only round. For several rounds, they are at this level. And that's probably actually the tendency that they expect for the future. And for instance, the ESS, they have decided they will switch mode also because of all this COVID situation that make a face-to-face field work that was lasting like 6 months very, very complicated to organize across 25 countries that all have different rules about the COVID situation. So they have already decided they will do the move to web. So then if you think about response rate for web, they are always lower than for face-to-face, even if you do it differently. And for the labor force, I don't know the number, but for sure they are available online and on their website, we should find them. But I would expect something like the ESS, so maybe around 70% on average, something like that. But even if it's higher, still actually, there is a girl that did a PhD on this topic, which is the link between response rate and representativity. And she argued that actually the higher the response rate, the worse the selection bias, because then the people that do not participate, they are even more different from the one that do participate. And all the PhDs about this topic, and so she had several papers and so on, showing that actually you may have a higher response rate and a lower representativeness of your sample. And I think we should also keep that in mind. So I put response rate because it's an easy way to mention this topic, and it was not the main point of my presentation, but it's very important to look really how the sample is distributed. And you may have a 70% response rate, but still have some kind of population that will never participate in survey like the ESS. Imagine it's more than 1 hour long and it's in our house. I would never let someone that just come and enter my house and do a 1 hour survey with this person. I mean, and I think many people are like that also nowadays. So that's really problematic.
Yeah, I would like to address what you asked. I only have the experience from Chile because I used to work in the labor force survey in Chile. And it's a very specific case, but the response rate was very high, like around 90%. But also it's because when you go to do the survey, you go with your uniform. I say, I come from the state. I am going to do the survey. You have to answer. We have a warning, but also if they don't, I mean, they cannot do it if they have the option to not do it. We could call the police, but we decided not to do it because it was more damaging at the end. And yeah, the response rate was very high. I think because of that, because you say, okay, I'm from the government and state, and at least in Chile, people trust in these institutions. But also what you have to worry, and that's my concern with surveys, and that is why I enjoy this, is that you can never trust a survey at 100%. Why? Because I've been doing surveys. I've seen people, how do you say, typing the answers. We had the case of interviewers making up the answers, etc. And that happens in every survey, even for us, that it was a very traditional and one of the more important surveys. And so, yeah, it's like you always have to be critical with this, yeah, and with what we are doing as well, because we know there are a lot of space for mistakes and errors and a lot of stuff. But yeah, I think that's for me, and that's what I love surveys, is that like we have this data set, but all the work behind that data set is something that we can't imagine on how dangerous it is in a way. But yeah, of course, we can trust survey, but always being critical on, and it's important, I think, that a mistake that sometimes we do is not being aware of the mistake, and it's trust in your figures, and that's it. And sometimes maybe, I mean, try to at least acknowledge what is going on, but yeah, I would say keep trusting. But yeah, like, well, and social scientists that we are, being critical, we do that kind of easily. So
yeah, and I think in this case, that's a good example. So if you really feel like you're forced to do it, the few that don't do it, they are clearly different from the others. So these are people that are really against the system. I'm not afraid of not doing things that they ask me to do. So this kind of people, you will really miss them, because they, for sure, they are different. No, if it feels like it's compulsory and they don't do it, that's not the average people not doing it.
Can I say something about this, Melanie? Yeah, well, I'm a little embarrassed to say anything about this since you are in the room, and Carlos also is in the room. So you guys are the two real experts on all of this. But there is a tendency, and I run that into a lot into also when I try to send something to a journal, that the gold standard is a probability sample. And those are like the way it should be any survey and this kind of stuff. And it's more and more and more surveys and saying, okay, this is not probability sample. But first, I have very serious concern about that. And number one is that very, very few surveys are gold standards, very, very few. Secondly, very few. Most of the surveys are not responding to any of that. In fact, they are open to a lot of errors that we even can control. Because, for instance, there is a replacement. We don't know how many times has been replaced. These people, I mean, the use of what is called the contact form to get information of what has been things going on in the fieldwork is nobody uses it, or is very scant, or is very reduced. So there is no way to know what is going on. So even the more expensive ones, that are half of information, they are really probabilistic, that take into account for the sample or original sample size, the initial error estimated, and on and on and on. Okay, the thing is that even in those situations, what we noticed, and the European Social Survey can tell you information about that, is that people, the response rate is reducing. So we are facing a situation that is not only very costly, those, and more costly, but in general, people, for whatever reason, is reducing the amount of response in this face-to-face participation. So we have to find, before it's there, mechanisms that improve and simplify the possibility of obtaining information. But not only that, and I think Melanie make it that point very clearly, it's not only a question of that, which is also very important, but it's a question of that we have to think, to take advantage, you have to think harder to take advantage of how we can use all of these to measure better, and that is that possibility is there. We only think about surveys like, oh, okay, I designed my question and blah blah blah, and I ask people. Well, there is other ways to measure things, and there are other ways to think about this. And Sig just gave a good example of that. Okay, I can say like I'm left and right, but on a scale 1 to 10. But in many countries, it happens in Latin America. Many people say, for instance, in the Dominican Republic, many people say, I am on the right. I'm on the right. I never was on the right. So obviously people are not understanding what it means left and right in many situations. But on the other hand, if I collect information, what these people is doing in terms of the newspapers that is reading, in terms of what if it's in social media, in what kind of social media he's involved on, and then studying in networks what he's doing, and collecting information at passive meter of all other stuff, maybe it's going to help me to really estimate what is the ideological position of this particular person. So in a way, we need to understand, and there's a lot of data out there. We can produce a lot of data, and we have to take advantage with this new technology to improve it. And so it's not only a question of comparing with the gold standard, which are not that gold standard anymore, and problematic by itself because it's decreasing and increasing, but also opens the window to other ways to think and measure and estimate the problems. And I'm talking about as a political scientist, not as a survey methodologist. Thank you.
People online, if there are any questions, you can also put them in the chat or just use the microphone.
All right, Melanie, yeah, we can close here. Melanie, I really enjoy your presentation. Thank you for presenting your work, which is amazing. You're incredible. And Carlos too, because of a lot of work you do, and Oriol too. You guys are doing incredible work in survey methodology. It's very an honor to collaborate with you and to have you in RECSM and all the stuff you're doing. Thank you for assisting to this presentation, and I hope we see more of your research in the coming years. Okay, thank you very much to everybody, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.